Jeremy Koons, man who needs no introduction. We're all thrilled to be here and the work you put together. Jeremy wrote an amazing book on Wilfrid Sellars ethics, source of a lot of insight, certainly informed my work. I know it has other people here. And today he's going to talk to us about team reasoning and morality as a deontological species of team reasoning. So thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Preston, for your kind words. This is a pretty intimidating crowd to give this talk in front of, but as I said, it's after lunch, so hopefully I can slide a whole bunch by you. There have been a lot of attempts over the years to understand the moral point of view as representing a distinctly communal or group point of view. These attempts date back to at least Rousseau, and they received renewed attention in the 20th century from authors as diverse as Emile Durkheim and David Gautier. Recent developments in group agency and team reasoning offer some promising avenues of exploration, as we've seen. However, I think we can also agree that there are some formidable obstacles in the way of understanding morality as a species of team reasoning. So what I want to do today is I want to lay out, I want to offer an elaboration of aspects of Wilfrid Sellars' ethical theory and argue that Sellars offers us the tools to reply to three significant challenges to understanding morality as a species of team reasoning. So the challenges are as follows. So first, there is the question of whether it's rationally mandatory to team identify in the first place. This is something that we've already talked about today. Is it rational to adopt the team reasoning as a strategy? This is what Sugden calls the external problem, or the question, should I endorse this mode of reasoning? So that's the first problem. The second problem, so suppose that you team identify, suppose that you recognize team reasoning as a legitimate mode of reasoning. There remains what Sugden calls the internal problem. So in joint action or in team action, I need some kind of assurance that others will do their part, or else it might not be rational for me to engage in team reasoning in this particular case, even if I group identify and support the team's objectives. So that's the internal problem. Third, and this is closely related to the second problem, there's what I'm calling the principled action problem. You can see these second and third problems as kind of the flip side of each other. Acting on a moral principle often requires doing some action in some circumstances, even if you know that others will not do the same. Can morality as team reasoning explain why this is required or even rational? So these are significant challenges to understanding morality as a species of team reasoning. So in what follows, I'm going to draw on the work of Wilfrid Sellars to argue that these problems arise chiefly because team reasoning is almost always understood in consequentialist and maximizing terms. However, I think this is an unwarranted assumption. Just as practical reasoning in general might be deontological rather than consequentialist in character, so too might team reasoning. I'm going to characterize a form of team reasoning which I call principled team reasoning, which offers a solution to the above three problems and is going to allow us, I hope, to construe morality as a rationally mandatory species of team reasoning. Okay, so individual reasoning versus team reasoning. I think I'm actually just going to skip over this part because this has already been covered by our previous authors. Yada yada, paradoxes of individual rationality, classical game theory can't explain these, team rationality can explain why we should all pick high, blah, blah, blah. Here's a quote from Natalie Gold and Robert Sugden. Classical theory can't explain stuff, amazing but true, it's caught in a vicious circle. Okay, we can just take this as read. Okay. Unfortunately, this will leave more time for you to ask me penetrating questions at the end, but there's nothing to be done for that. Okay, so obviously the question we should ask is not what I should do, but what should we do in situations like this. Accounts of team reasoning have been offered by, oodles and skadoodles of people, Bacharach, Sugden, Gold, and others. Okay, so research on team reasoning has proceeded in parallel with research on team agency and collective intentionality. To reason as a we, one must be able to conceive of oneself as a member of the we. One must be able to conceive of a collective unit of agency, having joint goals. Properly speaking, then, one cannot really talk, I think, of team reasoning without talking about joint or collective intentionality, for you can't ask what it's rational for us to do without framing the question in terms of some kind of joint or collective agent. Okay, so it's no easy task to argue that morality involves team reasoning. So most analyses of team reasoning, as with most analyses of joint intentionality, involve small teams performing discrete tasks, like a couple people carrying a sofa or a love seat or maybe just a really big chair. I'm not sure what that is, actually. So they don't propose to analyze entire societies, much less all rational agents. Exceptions do exist, such as, of course, Gautier. I want to argue that morality does involve team reasoning, but a common presupposition of the debate is that we approach the problem as individuals. And our identification as members of this or that team is contingent upon some condition, whether this is a psychological or a normative condition. Only once we team identify do we then face the decision whether team reasoning is rational for us. While this approach might be correct for small-scale teams, I think it can obscure when the topic is morality. Okay, so maybe the most significant issue facing the attempt to construe the moral point of view as arising out of team reasoning involves the issue of framing, which is the question of whether an individual frames a particular decision problem as one of individual rationality or as one of team rationality. So this is obviously where we encounter the external problem, which is the first problem that I laid out for you in the introduction. So the challenge is this. The moral point of view is supposed to bind rational agents categorically. It's not rationally, the moral point of view is not supposed to be rationally optional. But it's not obviously rationally optional for anyone to engage in team reasoning on any particular occasion when such reasoning is available. In fact, the consensus, as far as I can tell, is that it is not rationally mandatory to engage in team reasoning on any particular occasion. Bacharach, for example, discusses group identification in almost exclusively psychological rather than normative terms, as we heard earlier on, purely in terms of cause and effect. Sugden seems to think that group identification is qualified in a number of ways. So Sugden writes, to construe oneself as a member of a team, one must have some confidence that the other members of the team construe themselves as members too. Some highly qualified version of Sugden's claim might apply to moral agency, but it seems implausible in its unrestricted form. So the obvious problem is this: if team reasoning is optional, this presents an obstacle to understanding morality as a species of team reasoning. Various attempts have been made to surmount this problem by explaining how it's rational for individuals to adopt the team point of view, but I'm not going to look at those various approaches. I'm going to approach things from a slightly different direction. Sellars' argument is that group identification is rationally mandatory, but the sense of rationality here is thicker than instrumental rationality, which is something that Gold has suggested in writing and also just quite recently to us that it would have to be. Group identification is actually conceptually entailed by rational agency. So this would provide an argument for the moral community that bypasses any attempt to explain group identification in purely game theoretic terms or in terms of instrumental rationality or something like that. and it would provide an answer to our first problem, the external problem of whether to engage in team reasoning, whether to team identify in the first place. Okay, so as I said, one of the challenges facing us is to defend the rationality of team reasoning, and various authors have defended the rationality of team reasoning, but a lot of these authors often concede that there's no good way to argue that you must team reason when such reasoning is available. So, as the problem is often understood in the literature, our task is to show that team reasoning, adopting the viewpoint of the we, is somehow rationally mandatory, and that's a tall order. That's hard to do. Now, that's not incorrect per se, but it can be misleading, because this approach suggests that we begin with rationally self-interested agents, and then our task is to show that it's prudentially or individually rational somehow for these individual agents to team reason. So Sellars takes a different approach to this. He has no interest in reducing the communal standpoint to the individual standpoint. Rather, he argues that the concept of oneself as a rational being implies the concept of oneself as a member of an ethical community consisting of all rational beings. So, in other words, he argues for the conceptual necessity that, qua rational being, one already occupies the standpoint of the we. So this is a sense of rationally mandatory that has to be distinguished from prudential rationality. This is a much stronger sense of rationally mandatory. This is a kind of conceptual necessity. So, reasons of space prevent me from detailing. So I'm going to do something that's like in super bad form. I know this is really bad form. I can't give this argument in detail here. I just have to promise you that I've given it somewhere else, and it's like super amazing and super convincing, and you should all be totally convinced by it. But yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So yeah, my response to the external argument is going to be of necessity a little bit abbreviated. So communitarians like Charles Taylor have long pointed out that a lot of the literature, particularly around social contract theory, has this atomist assumption that you could be a rational agent without already being embedded in a concrete community. And that's behind sort of Lockean social contract theory and things like this. And Charles Taylor and other communitarians have argued that this atomist assumption is actually incoherent. You can't be a rational agent prior to membership in some concrete community. Your very identity is structured and largely constituted by your community's norms, values, and practices. But if that's right, then the concept of rational agency already implies group identification, not as a psychological matter, or not merely as a psychological matter, but as a conceptual matter. So you already occupy the standpoint of the we. You're already bound by its rules and its norms, just in virtue of being a rational agent. So there can be no rational decision as to whether you ought to reason as a member of the team. If you are a rational agent, then as a conceptual matter, such reasons are already binding on you before you can even consider the question. So what I would call global skepticism about the rationality of team reasoning is undercut. This is our response to the external problem. Well, that's the 10-cent version of it. If you want the $1.25 version, you have to go read my book, which is amazing, really. No. So questions about the bindingness of team reasoning don't arise at the global level. That's already answered. They're always local and contextual. So let me give you an analogy. So if you're part of a sports team, for example, you generally reason as a member of the team. You share the team's goals. You try to win as part of the team. But team reasoning and individual reasoning can conflict. So, for example, an important member of the team might have an injury and might have to decide whether they're going to play injured. So, on the one hand, the team really needs them for like an important game. So do they step up for the team? But then on the other hand, they might exacerbate the injury and delay their recovery. So here you have a conflict between team reasons and individual reasons. There's no algorithm for deciding such conflicts. Sellars, in a quote from Knowing the Better and Doing the Worse, which has already come up a couple of times, he calls the two viewpoints incomparable, and the choice between them, in an important sense, a choice between incommensurables. But the point is that you're choosing between 2 points of view that are already rationally binding on you. Sellars writes that while the communal and personal points of view could and would overlap, they are not only capable of conflict, but typically conflicting, though often to an undramatic degree. I think the degree to which these points of view conflict is easily overstated, but implicit in Sellars' argument, and in the claim that these viewpoints can overlap and conflict, is that the agent is subject already to both sets of reasons. And just as important, the communal point of view is not reducible to the personal point of view. So we're not faced with this global question of whether team reasons are binding on you at all, because they are, but with the local question of whether such reasons are decisive in this particular case. So I conclude that in addressing the external problem, Bacharach, Sugden, and others misframe the question by treating the bindingness of team reasons as though it were susceptible to global skepticism. It's not if the team in question is sort of the larger community, like the community of rational agents as such. So, like I said, that's the sort of 10-cent answer to the external problem, which I'm just going to take as given from here on out and ask for your forbearance on that. Timer fell asleep. Okay. We still have the second and third problems to answer. So, moving along. So, Sellars has an argument, I think, that if successful, provides an answer to the external question. This is an argument that he sort of gestures at in the last chapter of Science and Metaphysics. A number of people have tried to flesh it out in various different ways. So that's an argument that he has. So I'm going to take success of this argument as given, but as I noted in the introduction, if you want to attempt to construe morality as a species of team reasoning, you still have to answer these two other problems, the internal problem and the principled action problem. So if I want to finish this account of morality as a species of team reasoning, deontological team reasoning, then I have to articulate this type of reasoning, principled team reasoning, that would enable action without assurance. Okay, so I think the big stumbling block to articulating a notion of principled team reasoning is, as I've said, team reasoning is usually understood in utilitarian and maximizing terms. So Gold and Sugden's team reasoning schemas all explicitly mention the desire to maximize some utility function as motivating members of the team. Tollefson writes here, when a player reasons as a team member, he or she attempts to maximize the objective function of a set of players. This involves finding strategies that maximize the team's joint payoff. So these assumptions make it possible to model team reasoning in certain formal ways, but I think it also prejudices the discussion, because why can't teams reason in deontological ways as well as in consequentialist ways? Why do we have to make these sort of consequentialist assumptions? Well, what is team reasoning in its most general form? Well, as sort of a rough first, I mean, there's more to say about this, but for now, let's just use this as a placeholder. To engage in team reasoning is to reason in the we mode, in Tuomala's strong sense, where your reasoning makes essential use of group attitudes, such as group intentions or group beliefs and group commitments. This needs to be fleshed out more, but this is, like I said, a useful placeholder. There's no reason to assume in advance that such reasoning has to be consequentialist in nature. But let's begin our discussion of team reasoning with a discussion of group attitudes, since they're important to our account. So consider the following attitude which Smith can have qua member of organization. So Smith's belief is properly characterizable as an attitude sub-organization given two conditions. First, Smith and other members of the organization are mutually committed to various rules about the structure of the organization, in other words, that there's a leader, about the relationship of that leader to ordinary members, etc., about the bylaws, voting procedures, procedures for conducting meetings, rules of quorum, all that boring bureaucratic stuff, you know. And second, the belief in question is inferentially downstream from some set of these mutual commitments in a manner that we're going to outline later on in the talk. I say commitment because I think that's more accurate than belief. So Smith may not recall off the top of his head what the rules for quorum are, but he knows that the rule is laid out in the bylaws and is committed to a greater or lesser degree to binding himself by these bylaws, as are other members of the organization. Okay, so if we understand the notion of a group attitude, I think we can also understand the notion of team reasoning. So team reasoning can involve doxastic attitudes such as beliefs, as well as practical attitudes like intentions. So, for example, here you have an example of a doxastic group attitude and a practical group attitude. So for reasons I described above, both of these attitudes are attitudes that are held from the group point of view. Now, for my purposes, what I care about is group practical reasoning. So here's an example of group practical reasoning. A group that is reasoning from the standpoint of the we, from a group attitude, practical attitude, to another group practical attitude. And this is the kind of practical reasoning that I care about in this talk, and of course this is the kind of practical reasoning that sort of forms the core of what Sellars is up to, group practical reasoning. So, as I've said probably too many times so far, I think a lot of writing on team reasoning has assumed a utilitarian framework, but I don't think that is a warranted assumption. So, and I think that's true even if we assume, like Sellars did, that practical reasoning characteristically involves means-end reasoning. So he did think that practical reasoning typically involved means-end reasoning, but I don't think that means we have to understand it in consequentialist or maximizing terms. I think we can still give it a deontological interpretation. So let me see if we can make sense of some deontological version of this kind of practical reasoning and flesh out this notion of principled team reasoning so that hopefully we can understand some kind of deontological team reasoning that will help us answer the second and third challenges that were laid out. Okay, so Sellars, as we've already heard, is a lot of his thinking on practical reasoning is very Kantian. He thought that practical reasoning was means-end reasoning. Obviously, he diverged from Kant on a number of points. Here's one of the crucial questions for Sellars. When we engage in means-end reasoning, how do we detach the inferential consequence? So how do we draw practical inferential conclusions? So consider the analogy with theoretical reasoning. So good theoretical reasoning preserves truth. And truth allows one to detach inferential consequences. So if you have a conditional, and then you have a true premise, then that true premise allows you to detach the consequent of the conditional Q. So that's allowed. The truth is what allows you to detach inferential consequences in theoretical reasoning. Well, what would be the analogy in practical reasoning? What would allow you to detach practical consequences in inferential consequences in practical reasoning? Well, Sellars argues that an intention cannot be literally true. It can be reasonable. So Sellars would say that if you have an end intention, such as saving the whooping cranes, that is categorically reasonable, then the means intention, say petitioning city council to preserve the wetlands, is also reasonable. So if shall I do A is categorically reasonable, then we can detach the inferential consequence of this practical conditional, shall I do B. So reasonableness is transmitted by good practical inference. Now, again, relevant for Sellars' moral reasoning, if there were an end intention that were intrinsically reasonable, then that would confer categorical but derivative reasonableness on all the subsidiary intentions which could be derived from it. Now, the intrinsically valuable material end which he suggests in Science and Metaphysics is it shall we be the case that our general welfare is maximized. And he says that this, having this as the sort of formal end of morality is part of his strategy to harmonize teleological and deontological themes in Kant's ethics. Now, all this talk of teleological themes, as well as the talk of maximizing general welfare, might encourage a consequentialist reading of Sellars here and put us all the way back to square one. And I think, to be fair, Sellars probably was a rule consequentialist for most of his career. But I don't think we have to read Sellars as a consistent utilitarian, nor do I think that consequentialism is the best way to make sense of morality as team reasoning. So in Sellars' final, and I think most mature writing on ethical theory, all talk of maximizing has disappeared. So Sellars states the regulative principle of the moral point of view as follows. Shall each of us do that which in the circumstances promotes the happiness of each and every one of us, all relevant things considered? Now, again, Sellars thinks that all reasoning is, practical reasoning is means-end reasoning and has to be motivated by some good. And so Sellars says this intention has as its core a state of affairs intention, which is the formal specification of an intrinsic and encompassing good, shall be each and every one of us leads a satisfying life. That is the intrinsic good, which is sort of the lodestar of the moral point of view. Now, what I want to suggest is that this approach that Sellars has in his very last writing on moral philosophy indicates a move away from Sellars' earlier utilitarianism. In that, first, all talk of maximizing has disappeared. And in fact, you can search on reasoning about value, and the word maximizing does not appear a single time in the whole essay. It's not there. Second, the explicit use of each and every, I think, emphasizes the Kantian separateness of persons that is alien to the utilitarian outlook. So I do think that he moved away from his consequentialism very late in his career. And I'm pick and choose which part of Sellars I'm going to claim as authoritative. So our starting point in principled theme reasoning is going to lie in Sellars' claim that practical reasoning presupposes some substantive good. Now we want to see if this presupposition forces us into a consequentialist theory of practical reasoning. So let me give you an analogy. Suppose we identify the following state of affairs as good. Shall be, each and every one of us tells the truth, all relevant things considered. So that's the state of affairs we decide is intrinsically good. Okay, so, for Sellars, practical reasoning is reasoning involving these kinds of nomologicals like this. So suppose the following two nomologicals, the following two factual entailments obtain. If I tell the truth in a particular circumstance, then Smith and Jones will tell lies. If I tell a lie, then Smith and Jones will tell the truth. So what this means is that my lying will actually minimize the overall number of lies told. Whereas my telling the truth will actually maximize the number of lies in this particular circumstance. So the question is, does it follow that I ought to tell a lie in circumstance C, thereby minimizing the number of overall lies told? Only if you think that intrinsic goods create maximizing obligations rather than deontological obligations. But I'm not sure why you would automatically come to that conclusion. And given that there are a number of well-known problems with consequentialist moral theories, I think there's a lot of reasons to reject that conclusion. And I think this opens the door to a different model of reasoning, team reasoning. I think this allows us to, hopefully, points us in the direction of articulating a mode of team reasoning that's deontological rather than consequentialist, allowing us thereby to see morality in terms of a different kind of reasoning, principled team reasoning, which will help us solve the internal problem and the principled action problem. Okay, so let's see if we can articulate something like principled team reasoning. So let's take Sellars' model and on reasoning about value, which would be a schema for principled team reasoning. Okay, so this is what principled team reasoning looks like for Sellars. So this is basically taken straight from on reasoning about value. So the first premise specifies this intrinsic good, shall be each and every one of us leads a satisfying life, all relevant things considered. The second one is just a nomological, it's factual entailment. This each and every one of us leads a satisfying life implies each of us does A1 and C1, A2 and C2, and then you just draw the practical conclusion from that. Therefore, shall each of us does A1 and C1, A2 and C2, and then that's a conclusion about what we all should do. What should I do? And that's the conclusion. Therefore, shall I do A1 and C2, A1 and C1, A2 and C2, etc. So that's the schema for principled team reasoning there. Now, here's something important, and this is something we're going to come back to a little bit later because this is crucial. So Sellars' mature view is that the latter intention is a we intention because it is derived from an intersubjective intention. He articulates this view in a number of different places in his later work. So this is a we intention not because it's actually shared, and this is going to be a crucial point in solving our puzzle. It's a we intention not because it's shared, but because it's derived from this intersubjective intention. Now, another feature of principled team reasoning, one that Sellars insisted on throughout his career, is that one can act on an unshared intention. The following passage from On Reasoning About Value is intentional, is rather typical. He said, it's essential to note that the intention, shall any of us do A if in C, must not be confused with the intention, shall every one of us do A if in C. The latter is an intention which is realized only if every one of us who is in C does A. The former is realized even if only a single one of us who is in C does A. So he is very clear that on his model of sort of we reasoning in the we mode, not everybody has to engage in an action for it to be a legitimate case of we mode action. And this feature of moral reasoning is difficult to capture if we understand team reasoning in strictly consequentialist or maximizing terms. That's great, but does it make any sense? Like, how can unshared action be team action? If I'm the only person doing it, how can I be then acting as part of the team? Isn't that just incoherent? I'm so glad you asked. Principled team reasoning may require that one act in a way that others don't. So how can a moral attitude reflect team reasoning if it's not shared? And how can a moral attitude be normatively correct if it is unshared? These seem like plausible questions, a question that an advocate of principled team reasoning has to understand. It's an attitude that Sellars owes us an answer to, right? Because again, he thinks that something could be an example of a we attitude even if it's completely unshared. Something that I think Steffi had that quote from him. So we already have most of the elements of our answer in place. So for Sellars, as I've said, a group attitude is identified by its derivation, not from the fact that it's actually shared. So for example, Sellars writes the following in a letter to David Solomon. The moral point of view involves the form, we shall any of us do A if in C, which entails I shall do A if C, to flag its origin or ground in a logically intersubjective intention. I represent the latter as shall we, I do A if C. So, This is team reasoning for Sellars. I can only we intend if my intention is derived. So here's what I think is important that we have to recognize about Sellars. It's true that my we intention is a we intention because it was derived from an intersubjective intention. But I think the crucial thing to recognize about Sellars is that my we intention has to be derived from intention that is in fact shared. And that's what I think is crucial to recognize, why we have to recognize that this is in fact a form of team reasoning. So, to give this example that he always gives, I can only intend, qua member of the Whipping Crane Society, if there's a founding intention that's actually shared by other members of the Whipping Crane Society, an intention that creates society in the first place. I can't intend qua member of the Whipping Crane Society if there is no Whipping Crane Society. So there has to be an actually shared intention creating the society, and then I can have unshared intentions qua member of the Whipping Crane Society that are derived from this founding intention. But the team has to be there in the first place. And then I can have an unshared we intention derived from this actually shared intention. I can only intend qua member of organization if there's a shared commitment to the structure and rules governing organization. But these shared commitments are precisely what enable the unshared commitments. Or they're precisely what enable these to be unshared we commitments. So consider a parallel that Tuomola makes with institutional norms. So even in the case of strongly social concepts like that of being a leader in an organization, as Tuomola says, there are constraints for correct collective acceptance. So if Smith is elected leader of organization, but it turns out that, for example, a quorum wasn't present at the meeting, then the election was not valid, and he is not, in fact, the valid or legitimate leader of the organization, even if people take him to be so. So someone could challenge his status as leader, demand a revote, whatever. And so, for example, I may be the only person in the entire organization to hold the attitude, I believe, sub-organization, Smith is not the leader, and yet my attitude is the group attitude, and it's the correct one, even though it's not shared. Even though I'm the only person in the organization who holds this attitude, it's the right one. Now, there's a few things to notice about this example. First, my possession of this belief here, which I hold qua member of organization, obviously presupposes a great deal of agreement with other members of the organization, agreements about the structure of the organization, about the bylaws, etc., etc., etc. So I'm only able to dissent qua member of organization because we already share so many attitudes that are correctly characterizable as attitude sub-organization. So unshared we attitudes presuppose agreement in the background. It presupposes the agreement that creates the team in the first place. And that's what you have to keep in mind about Sellars, and that's what you have to keep in mind about principled team reasoning. And this is not merely true in institutional cases. This is true wherever we dispute over norms. A dispute over a semantic norm, like what does beg the question really mean, presupposes massive agreement without which we couldn't even be characterized as having a semantic dispute, nor could we have a specifically moral dispute or argument without a background of agreement about the subject matter of morality. Any discourse, including dissent, presupposes the kind of shared group attitudes that are at the heart of Tuomola and Gilbert's and Sellars' accounts. So when Sellars argues that Jones can have a moral we intention that nobody else possesses, Jones is the only person who has this moral we intention, one has to understand this in the context of an ongoing social practice that has massive agreement in the background. So suppose that Jones has this particular intention, others don't share it. So essentially Jones is making in the moral sphere the same move that I made in organization when I said, I don't believe that Jones is not the legitimate leader. Jones here is conveying that given certain background agreement, like on the agreement on the formal ends of morality, certain abstract principles of justice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We are, in fact, committed to doing AI and CI, even if others don't agree with me. Such a move can only be understood in the context of significant agreement over what morality requires, what can be appealed to as reasons, and so on. So in general, the game of giving and asking for reasons presupposes general agreement in attitudes as the background for arguing over the remaining areas of disagreement. So while principled team reasoning allows one to have a non-shared moral intention, such an intention does presuppose a massive background of agreement. Therefore, the team is never wholly absent from team reasoning and principled team reasoning. Okay, my timer keeps going to sleep. Oh, got to wind this up. Okay, luckily I'm at the conclusion. So I've argued that a barrier to seeing morality as a species of team reasoning is the dominant construal of team reasoning and maximizing in consequentialist terms. But I think there's no reason antecedently to assume that all practical reasoning has a consequentialist character, and so I don't think there's reason to assume that team reasoning in particular has such a character. If we approach team reasoning from a different perspective, I think we're able to articulate a different conception, principled team reasoning, that allows us to make sense of various features of moral reasoning as a species of team reasoning. I mined the writings of Wilfrid Sellars, particularly his late writings, for insights as to how we can understand the moral point of view as a rationally mandatory species of principled team reasoning. I think much insight into team reasoning has come from game theoretic discussions. I think that this alternative approach is more in line with what Sellars thought, and I think offers us a better tool for understanding the specifically deontological features of moral reasoning. Thank you very much.
We started 5 minutes late, so I think we'll go till 2:50, and I'm going to institute the finger rule. So if you have a hand, you'll be on the list. If you want to have a follow-up, that'll be signified with a finger, and then you go off the list if you do that. So we'll start with Ronald. We've got Kirk.
Thank you, Jeremy. Just a question regarding something you said about sleep. So we can only morally to the agency if the intention is derived from an intention that is in fact shared, right?
Yeah.
So the team in the moral case will be the community of all rational beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm worried that what you may get is only local agreement. Agreement with the culture, the group that you are in, the particular group that you are in.
Yeah.
And so that maybe cells would say that or should say that someone can reinvent a new agency all alone within in the local context, only against the background in the local context of agreement, but it doesn't follow that there's global
Yeah. Yeah, and I was actually corresponding with Matthew Chrisman on this point, because like he and I are both sort of struggling with this point. And I go back and forth on this. In my more manic and optimistic moods, I think there's absolutely an argument that the community consists of all rational beings. It's an argument I laid out in chapter 13. It's this idea that, the epistemic community is the same as the moral community, and if I can talk with you, then that means you're a member of the community of rational beings and you're a moral agent, yada, 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 right? And I don't 100% think that that's a bad. Like I said, in my optimistic moods, I think that that's certainly the argument that Sellars thought was there. And like I said, in my more optimistic moods, I think that there's a through argument there. In my more pessimistic moods, I'm sort of like contingency, irony, solidarity. I'm sort of like Richard Rorty. I'm sort of like, well, what you have is local communities, and the sort of liberal commitment is to keep expanding the we and making it bigger and bigger and bigger, but there's no transcendental argument that the we is everybody prior to any political action. The expansion of the we is an ongoing moral activity, and the best you can do is just try to make the we more expansive and more expansive and more expansive, and try not to fall back into further tribalism. And I honestly go between these two poles. But at the end of the day, I'm really not sure what your alternative is, right? Because if you start with a social practice account of anything, then you're going to start with the norms you have at hand. And those norms are going to include norms as to who's bound by norms. Yeah.
So I've got a finger from Bill. Please turn the, yeah, that's okay. I'm glad Ronald raised this issue because I was worrying about it as we got to the end. But I'm worried now that there's actually a sort of methodological tension there. So it's not just that there are these two elements in Sellars, but sometimes he goes one way and sometimes he goes the other. But it seems as though if you have the sort of transcendental line of argument based on the nature of reasons for this community of all rational beings, it just doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that could actually have a sort of historical founding moment. Right. So, it does seem as though. So my initial thought was community of rational beings, that's sort of extended all across time and space and so on. How could that be anything other than a sort of virtual, imagined, I've got to, set up some institutional structures for purely possible beings on Alpha Centauri and so on. Now, although I think you can sort of set up institutions for sort of future people and different, right? It seems as though you've still got to have an actual historical moment where it happens. Mm-hmm. But if you sort of, your case for it is this sort of transcendental argument about the nature of reasons, that suggests that it can't be something that has a particular time and place, because so at any time and place where it could happen, we've got to already be capable of reasoning. So I'm worried that the sort of, it's not just that there are two elements in the picture, but it's that the two elements in the picture you've given us seem as though they might actually be incompatible with one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you might be right about that. I mean, I think Sellars, it sometimes wants to be Kantian and Hegelian. But as I said, and this isn't really an answer to your question, I fully acknowledge that. I do think that Sellars thinks that, Brandom has this bit in Freedom and Constraint by Norms where he's like, how do you treat someone as a person? You translate what they say. And so, this is basically Sellars, right? He has this footnote in Chapter 7 in Science and Metaphysics where he said, well, the question is that, I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but he says it's not a question of like, who's the we? It's the question of shareable by whom, right? That he says that's the key question: shareable by whom, right? He seems to really think that if you can share this intention, like if you're capable of sharing this intention, if I can communicate with you and share this intention with you, then I really don't have a good reason to exclude you from whatever this community is that I'm a part of. And I don't think he regards that as incompatible with the historical, concrete, bounded community story. It just means that it's ad hoc for me not to sort of connect in morally and rationally significant ways you to that ongoing historical rational community, and to exclude you from it, and to treat you as sort of not part of the we. So I guess that turned into kind of an answer, but maybe not one that satisfies you.
Okay, so we have Kirk and then Glenda, Kyle, and Heath.
Okay, thanks very much for that. So this is a little bit of follow-up in the previous discussion. It does seem to me there's going to be a problem if not every member of the community rational agents shares the same intention. And I was thinking it would be good to make sense of the possibility of someone having a we intention with the relevant content on which the person can act when you don't have everybody sharing the intention. Now, the way you are reading the shall, sub we, I do A and C was that that's legitimate only if it's derived from the individual's intention, which is in fact shared by every member of the community. And I guess when I was reading on reasoning about values, I didn't see that as the way to read the sub-we. He does say that's crucial for intending from the point of view of the community. I was reading that sub-we as just indicating it's derived from the individual's intersubjective intention of the relevant form. So if you read it that way, you could get to that, and the person would have the commitment, and he could act on it legitimately without there being a shared intention by all members of the community.
Right.
So, and then you just have to make the case for it making sense to do that, even if the person knows or is doubtful that everybody shares the intention.
Right.
And it seems to me that we probably can make a good case for that. I'm going to try to do that tomorrow.
Yeah. Okay. I look forward to that.
Glenda.
Yeah, I guess mine is also a follow-up on all of the previous.
Clearly, this
But
is problematic.
yeah. But I guess I agree that that deriving the we intention as categorically valid and moral from a we which is not already categorically valid is shared, but it's not categorically valid. So therefore, what follows from it is also not, it's only under the scope of the if this, only with those with whom we share the intention, then the obligation will follow. But it wouldn't follow unrestrictedly, unconditionally. So my way of thinking about this was whether, and I was seeing I was agreeing a lot with your questioning of the utilitarian reading, in the idea that maximizing was going to be the way of understanding the difference between we mode and I mode. But then why can't we be more deontologically principled and think that the we that is at issue is a we that is a universal we? So the we from which my obligation to act now with respect to you follows is a we that is the we, a universal we, a we that is not qualified under any particular shared agreement. The happiness of everyone.
Right.
Not the happiness only of those that have these founded intentions with me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I would say a couple of things. One, and this kind of gets back to one of the things that Kirk said, you know, at the end of On Reasoning About Value, you know, he gives this analogy with the Whooping Crane Society, and he says, you know, well, you have this founding intention of the Whooping Crane Society, which is categorically valid for them, and then, you know, other intentions are derived from that. But then he says, you don't have the Whooping Crane Society unless people actually share this intention. And then he says, is there an analogous intention for the moral point of view? And you're right, he never comes out and says it has to actually be shared, but I think it's clear from the analogy that he means it actually has to be shared, because he's actually very specific that the Whooping Crane Society founding intention actually has to be a shared one. And then he goes directly and says, would there be an analogous founding intention for the moral point of view? It's this one. So that's why, but then also, but then on a more philosophical point is that at some point, I think it's just not team reasoning if you're the only person doing it. Like, I mean, there has to be this, it has to be grounded in some kind of actual real group attitudes, even if it's unshared. I mean, I think we can grant Sellars' point that you can have a group attitude that is kind of your own, but if it's not derived from actually shared attitudes, then where's the team? I mean, the team has to be there somewhere. And so I think if you don't have these attitudes that are in fact actually shared, then it's just not team reasoning anymore. It's something else.
Can we not idealize? Can we not have an idea of an ideal we, which informs dealing with actual ways? Why couldn't it be an ideal of a rational society, a rational community?
I think Kirk either wants to bail me out or dig the hole deeper. I don't know. I mean, to me, for me, this is this is the, I mean, to me, this is sort of Kant, I guess, but I mean, for me, Kant is still very much an individualist, which I guess is one of the things that Hegel wanted to correct in Kant, was this individual. I mean, the community of rational beings is still very much a hypothetical community. It's not a real community. It's not a real team. And you know, we had the quotes from Catherine Elgin that to me, speak to the sort of the insufficiency of that if we're trying to build an account of team reasoning. I mean, to my view, that doesn't get you the team per se, but you know, to quote the dude, that's just like my opinion, man. Kirk?
So it seems to me there are two ways of thinking about team reasoning. There's from the point of view of the team's benefit, and then there's the team all reasoning from the point of view of the team's benefit.
Yeah.
So you could read it in the sort of holistic way, but you also read it from the point of view of the individual. And you could have a commitment to team reasoning even if you don't think everybody else is on board. And this would be like non-ideal team reasoning.
Yeah.
Right? And then what you're going to do is adjust what you're going to do in light of not everybody being on board so as to maximize whatever the function is that you think of as the group's good. So that'd be a way of continuing to be committed to reasoning from the point of view of the team without thinking that team reasoning in the holistic sense, all the conditions are in place for that. And so that, I think, would be, you know, a way of thinking about how you could still, you know, do what you think is the right thing from this point of view without thinking everybody is sharing with you that point of view.
Right. Yeah. I'm going to have to think that one over.
Kyle, and then Heath.
Hey, thank you so much for this. Very, very cool.
Thank you.
I ask on the theme that's already here. I don't want to follow up on that. I want to bring in a different thing about the argument against consequentialism. I was going to suggest maybe we could rescue a kind of consequentialism. It just wouldn't be a welfare maximizing one. That and I think it would fit with the lying examples. So the ORAV intention said something about each and every one of us lead a satisfying life.
Yeah, sorry, I just broke everything.
Sure.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
And I mean, to me, that sounds like there's a theory of value there. Or there's some notion of welfare in satisfying life.
Yeah.
And this would entail duties, or this would entail actions or intentions for me to act in such a way that has satisfaction as a consequence.
Right.
But it needn't be maximal scope. But it could just be a smaller scope. So there's like normative theories that are like progressive consequentialism, but not maximal consequentialism. And that might fit with the I shouldn't lie.
Right.
Even though others will.
Right.
And so I think it's not deontological, it's consequentialist. So maybe, so I'm convinced on your argument against maximizing. But I think there's a version of consequentialism that is still viable.
Right.
And fits with everything else that you say.
I appreciate that. And I think, honestly, Sellars was a little bit lazy about spelling out, you know, what the final ultimate good is. I mean, you know, when I read some of his commentary on, you know, Plato and Aristotle, for example, I think, oh, well, he's eudaimonistic. He's not really utilitarian. But then he throws in these formulations and science and metaphysics that sound pretty real consequentialist. And I sometimes wonder if that's just like sort of a placeholder that he's sticking in that doesn't really reflect what he really thinks. And I really have trouble pinning down what his actual view is on what the ultimate good is, what the shape of that is, and what his axiology is. But I think that's a really helpful suggestion. Thank you.
Thanks. That's really good. I do have a question, which I'm worried is a dumb question. But, so, team reasoning is introduced to explain and make sense of coordination and cooperation in solving collective action problems. And so I guess I'm wondering, once you go deontological and you say things like, I'm going to tell the truth regardless of what anybody else says, you're not trying to solve collective action problems anymore. You're not coordinating or cooperating or anything like that. So what's teamy about it? Like, why wouldn't you just, why not just do that from the I mode? And we could just skip the whole, collective intentions and we reasoning and all that stuff.
Because I still think there's something insightful about the idea that moral reasoning is reasoning from the point of view of the we. Even if moral reasoning. So I used to think that. I actually had this conversation very briefly with Steffi, although she probably doesn't remember this. That I used to think that morality did largely serve the purpose of coordination, and I'm increasingly becoming convinced that actually it doesn't. It's not a coordinating function. It's not a coordinating practice, which would make sort of conventional team reasoning very inappropriate to model it. Okay. Nevertheless, I think that at the basis of any social practice, there is a large degree of coordination. But I think this is just a basic Wittgensteinian point about, forms of life and the kind of agreement that is presupposed by disagreement. But then I have a kind of larger attitude that almost everything we do is in the we mode, just because of the pre-existing form of life and social practice that is presupposed by human endeavor. So, okay. I wrote a paper for him about that. It's in that book over there.
So, Steffi.
Yeah, still. Okay, I have two questions just about details. And the first one is you wanted to make much of this distinction between shall any of us and shall everybody do A and Sellars. And I'm never really very clear about what he means when he does that. This moves like opaque to me. Because in many other places he just phrases these community intentions as shall each of us do A, and that sounds very much like shall everybody of us do A. So I wondered how you see that. This is just my own confusion about Sellars and at that point. And then I'd like to ask, I agree that there is this shift from science and metaphysics to on reasoning about values in this overarching and in how he formulates it, and that's probably quite a decisive thing. Like an intentional shift, and however, when we take it shall be the case that each of us lead a satisfying life as our overarching end, that might perhaps blur the boundary between an I perspective and a we perspective, because now it seems as if I have an obligation to lead a satisfying life as part of fulfilling this group aim of each and every one of us leading a satisfying life. So I should say that I somehow morally ought to lead a satisfying life. In fact, this can be derived from that, and that strikes me maybe as not very intuitive. I'm not sure. How do you see that?
Yeah, that's actually, so the first one, yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree that, when he says each and every one of us, that does seem to be logically equivalent to everyone. So it does seem like he's taken 2 steps forward and then 3 steps back, at least as far as the logical point goes. I do still think that, you can develop a team reasoning schema that allows you to derive obligations from that, deontological obligations from that, but yeah, you're right. He doesn't help us out a lot with the sort of logical this quantifier C uses there. That's true. But yeah, as for your second question, I agree. That's an odd obligation to draw because I have the view, which I don't know how common this is, that I don't know how many self-directed moral obligations you have. Maybe none. I don't know. But yeah, the idea that like I have a moral obligation to have a satisfying life, qua one of us. That does sound a bit odd. I mean, for some people that's perfectly unobjectionable, because lots of people think that we do have self-directed moral obligations, and they find nothing odd or weird about that. But I'm being part of the lax 21st century crowd, I do. It does sound odd to my ear. That's a good point.
So I'm going to insert myself into the queue here. So it goes back to this initial exchange, which I think I was sort of curious about this stuff too. Why suppose that even grant that there is a universal kingdom of rational beings that I am obliged to recognize in virtue of the fact that I reason or I speak or I think. Why think that the commitment to that involves also commitment to that being a moral community? And so I like the thought of sort of drawing Hegel in here. And so I wonder what you would think about an attempt to ground the sense of commitment to a moral community along sort of Hegelian lines in this regard. So at the beginning of self-consciousness, the self-consciousness chapter, Hegel says, spirit's already on the scene. What remains to be done is to show what the experience of spirit is, and he characterizes that as the experience of an I that is we and a we that is I. And so you might think that, and then reading just the phenomenology, the way the spirit chapter argues that the conceptual distinctions drawn in reason are actually played out in these events in history. So you might think that, well, the reason you have to see yourself as part of a universal kingdom of ends is because it exists. These are the things that have happened in history that have made this the case. And then it's just a matter of like whether or not you are rationally responsive to facts about the world. It's the social world, but in the same way that like if you believe in a geocentric view of the Earth today, you're just confused about what we've learned about things. And similarly, if you don't see yourself as part of a rational a community, a moral community, you're just missing out on what's happened. Now, that I don't like that because it seems like it makes it historically contingent. What if things had gone differently?
Right.
And you might tell a story about how, look, it was going to happen anyway. I think Hegel's going to be like this. Eventually, this was going to happen because of the ways in which we struggle for recognition, and so ultimately it was going to get here. So, yeah, do you think that would be a way of maybe addressing some of these concerns about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the way. I honestly, I think that there are a lot of ways to go about it. But for me, the most intuitive way for me is that I don't ever think Sellars thought that there was like a really bright line between like epistemic norms and moral norms and other kinds of theoretical norms. And I think you see a lot of support for this in literature. Searle, for example, when he's writing about the kind of norms that are generated by the institutions which create society in the first place, these aren't just sort of like epistemic and theoretical norms. They also create all kinds of sort of deontic obligations. Habermas, when he's talking about the kind of norms that are generated by sort of theoretical activity, he talks about the different kinds of sort of practical norms that are involved in the pursuit of truth, like norms of sincerity and norms of honesty. I mean, there's moral norms that are bound up merely with just being a rational agent. And so this idea that like you can take our norms and you can just silo them and say, I'm going to follow epistemic norms, but not any moral norms. It's completely artificial for Sellars that there's this bright line to be drawn, and you can do one, but you can not do the other. Well, I'm going to follow linguistic norms, but I'm not going to follow any moral norms. It's just for him. I don't think it makes any sense, and that's why I think for him, and this kind of gets back to some of the other comments that I've had. Like, if I can interact with you as a rational agent, then a fortiori I'm interacting with you as a moral agent, because there really is this intertwinement of the different kinds of normativity. And you know, Sellars also thought that the form of the good is the form of forms. He really thought that at the pinnacle of all normativity is practical normativity. That like you can't be a rational agent without being responsive to practical norms in the first place. That's that's what he says in Reason and the Art of Living. I can't remember. I always defer to Steffi on Sellars' exegesis questions. Yeah. So that's at the end of the day, you know, like when I said, when I'm optimistic and I'm thinking, you know, thinking big and thinking Sellars has this transcendental argument. Those are the lines in which it goes.
Thank you, Jeremy.